Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm pumped as always to be here with you. And I'm also super thrilled to welcome my friend from the US and sometimes co-host, Joe Mascara. How are you, sir?
Oh, man, I'm so happy to be back, David. It's been too long. You've been interviewing all these awesome keyboard players without me, and I can say you've been doing a fine job of it, too. I've been watching all the episodes, and they're awesome.
No, thank you. Very kind. And, it's great to have you back. And we're back together for a pretty special occasion. So we've just finished an interview with the amazing Robert L. Doerschuk. Now, for those of you of a certain vintage, so sort of Joe's and my age, Bob is one of the most amazing keyboard-oriented, but also more widely music journalists that in US and has played. We also talk about how he's played, but he's written for some of the most iconic magazines that we all know and love. Keyboard Magazine being the most obvious one, but he's written for Rolling Stone. He's written for a whole bunch of things. Joe, I think it's fair to say that there's quite a lot of insights in this interview.
Oh, absolutely. I learned a lot about what he does and why all the articles I've read from him were so good.
Exactly. So, no, I think you'll enjoy this a great deal. There's a lot of insights on both music and writing for music or music journalism. I think you'll enjoy it a great deal, and we'll talk to you after the show. Bob, it's an absolute honour and pleasure to have you on the show, sir. Can't thank you enough for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is a thrill. I'm enjoying it too.
Now, Bob, I'm going to show my age a little bit. For me, this is probably an I am not worthy moment. So as we'll hear throughout the interview, you've got an incredible career in music journalism and also as a musician. And I've been aware of you since at least the early 80s. Being in Australia, Keyboard Magazine was probably the only keyboard-related publication we could get. I obviously saw your byline. Then, in my case, it was travelling over, I don't know what it is in miles, but over 100 kilometres to the nearest larger town to buy Keyboard Magazine that had probably been published 7 months ago. So it's an absolute honour to have you on the show. So it's really great to have you. But I thought we'd kick off just with where you're living now, and you're still going strong as a musician. Tell us about your current musical gig.
Well, I'm living in Nashville, Tennessee. I've been here for 20 years at this point, actually.
Wow.
I'm kind of amazed to say. And, I consider it home right now. As far as being a writer, I'm more or less retired. I'm not really, I'm 72 years old and I'm ready to start taking it easy. But I continue to play piano and have been for about 10 months working at a restaurant playing my Yamaha grand piano for the folks at Gannon's, which is a high-end eatery here in Nashville.
And tell us about that gig, because that's obviously a gig of its own type. So tell us how you approach that. Obviously, it's playing piano. Do you mix things up to keep yourself interested? Like, what's your approach to playing those?
Well, I guess more than anything else, as a pianist, I'm a restaurant piano player. I've been doing it for many, many years. I like to say that I'm far from the best keyboard player in Nashville. Far from it, but I might be the top restaurant piano player, which is to say that, I know that my purpose there is to enhance the ambiance rather than try to dominate it and put on a show. That's why specifically I think they hired me in this case. I'd worked for the folks who purchased Gannon's previously at Skull's Rainbow Room, which is a famous, somewhat historical nightclub here in Nashville. And it was the same kind of a deal there. I just sort of played music. I follow the mood of the room. If it's a festive night, if they've got a football game on and everybody's having a great time, I'll kind of pep it up a little bit. Typically, when I start, it's quiet. It's the beginning of happy hour, so it's all very mellow and so forth. And I take my cues from the crowd. Obviously, I take requests. If I'll play whatever they ask for if I know it, and so it's all very ambient oriented.
Great. And so, Bob, how much do you have how do you like your repertoire? You've got a lot of it, up there in your head. You're running off sheet music or iPads, or how are you doing that?
I've been playing this gig without any sheet music at all because I've been playing these songs for many years. I tend to play the jazz standards, the American songbook stuff, Gershwin, Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart, things like that. That's my main repertoire. I also, I sort of edge tentatively into more modern stuff now and then. If somebody wants Piano Man, I'll play Piano Man. If whatever. And it's ironic that that's the more modern stuff because that's what fits. But still, me, it's like brand new. So yeah, I just and sometimes I just improvise a little bit. If my mind wanders, if I forget where I am in a certain, I'll turn it into an improvisation.
That's great, Bob. Can you tell us about your musical upbringing, how it all started, and to get you to where you are today?
Sure. Well, both my parents were musicians, among other things. Both played piano. My mother, just as an amateur, she just would diddle around on the keys every now and then. I was growing up outside of Chicago in the early 50s. My dad was, like me, he had a full-time job someplace as a television producer at WGN-TV in Chicago, but he had a lot of experience as a musical arranger as well. And in fact, he ended his working years as an emigre living in London, where he worked full-time as a freelance composer for the BBC and for other folks over there. So, I developed an appreciation of music simply from being in that household. My father he specialized in, his record collection included kind of a vocal-oriented music, whether it's Tony Bennett or Frank Sinatra, things like that, with big orchestral arrangements. And at a certain point, I began to absorb the kind of harmonic sensibilities of that music. The main thing, though, is there was a piano in the house, and it was right outside of my parents' bedroom. So to this day, I'm thankful that it was amazing. I'd get up at 6 a.m. as a little 5-year-old kid and go over to the piano and just start banging around on it just to get my bearings. They never told me to stop, ever. And I'm more or less taught myself as a result through the years. I did take trumpet lessons, but those days are long behind me. So there are advantages. There are fewer advantages than there are disadvantages to being self-taught, but nonetheless, I think I developed into a pretty good. My chops are pretty good, and I can acquit myself well on most gigs. So that's what I did. I went through school, played the school band, played in my first kid rock and roll band back when I was in junior high school. My dad also became a diplomat at some point. He had a very good career. So I spent my high school years in Ankara, Turkey, where I played with Turkish musicians. To this day, I can still play some Turkish pop songs if you want to hear them. And, picked up some of that repertoire and some of that vibe. It was a whole different, obviously a radically different thing. And from that point on, it was just playing in bands. I don't know. I wound up in college at the University of Texas, Austin, which is a real music town. I was playing a Hammond B3 in those days, working at sort of grimy clubs while I was also going to classes and hobnobbed with a musical scene there. So, and on and on. It just goes from there.
Since you had so much musical background, can you talk to us about how you ended up in journalism? I don't want to say instead, but as well.
Yeah, it was never said. I've always had parallel interests in journalism and in music. I always was kind of a verbal kid. I was a good student, and I read a lot, so forth. And it was just sort of natural to gravitate toward preferring to write about music, although I did get a degree in journalism, University of Texas. And I got my first job out of college was with a newspaper, so I was writing kind of standard news stories, but gravitating more toward the entertainment section, starting to do artist interviews. This was in Austin around 1974, something like that. I got satisfaction from both lines of work. So from that day, from Austin when I was a full-time newspaper kid and at night a working musician. That pattern sustained itself throughout basically my whole life up until my recent retirement and from journalism. So they just complemented each other.
Yeah, they certainly are complementary. And Bob, it's fair to say it's obvious your journalism degree because of the quality of your writing. So, I mean, we want to cover a whole range of this stuff, but just a superficial question. Do you recall your first big interview where, and it doesn't have to be musician, but where you thought, okay, I've got something here that I want to continue with?
First, okay. Well, I remember my first news assignment with the Austin American-Statesman, the newspaper, right out of journalism school. They said, one of the editors said, "Hey kid, there's a fire happening at this address in Austin. Why don't you go down and cover the fire?" I mean, like what, with blankets or something? No, write about it. Write about the fire. So we drove. I drove over there, and here's this building kind of flaming, and all these people standing around outside. And I did what everybody, whether they're a new reporter or they've been there for 50 years, is go up to somebody and say, "Hi, what happened?" And get the name, get the age, and sort of write it up. I found that I didn't enjoy watching these people become homeless. That was no fun at all. But I enjoyed covering an event, taking notes, going back, and writing it up on deadline. I love deadlines. I work best with the clock ticking. Never had writer's block. That was always something that I did well. And so I think I was much more suited to journalism than I was toward, let's say, literature or something like that. Without a deadline, I kind of flail around and waste a lot of time.
I'm hearing you. And and I don't mean this in the way of it's something that's past, although it is somewhat past. What are the disciplines of journalism that were instilled in you that you still use today that is probably perhaps missing from a lot of modern approach to writing?
I can't really address modern approaches to writing because I'm not a modern guy, but I think I was always guided by the idea of the inverted pyramid and, that formula: start with the lead, expand on it, the second paragraph, get broader, this sort of thing. That's how I was trained to write. I modified that, developed my own approach over the years somewhat, but the whole idea is get people's attention right at the start and try to anticipate what questions they might ask about whatever you're writing about and address them in a way that brings them deeper and deeper into the story. So I guess these days people call it clickbait online, but I think clickbait is just writing a good lead. I think it's the same thing. I don't see the difference. So, I try to get the vibe of the room. Actually, let me back up just a second. So in traditional journalism, it's just the facts pretty much. But as I began doing more and more interviews, I began realizing I wanted to create this feeling of the reader being in the room with this person, like I was sort of a doppelganger for the reader. And so I described the vibe, the ambiance, the whatever, and that became sort of an essential ingredient as I got deeper and deeper into writing about music, because obviously music is so full of colorful people, and it just helps the story to bring the reader face to face with the subject that way.
No, great perspective. And so I do want to move to your amazing Substack. So for our listeners and viewers that may not have been previously aware of Bob's work, although I don't think there'll be a lot of those, Bob, you run a great Substack called Van Cliburn Punched Me in the Mouth. Now, I'm the first to put my hand up that when I first started following that, I had to look up who Van Cliburn is. I'm a bit of a heathen in regards to pianists, but I now understand that. But just tell us how the title came about, and then we'll explore that a little bit more.
Okay. I'm glad you noticed that, and thank you very much for those comments. I was working for Keyboard Magazine and was assigned to interview the world famous Van Cliburn, classical pianist, legendary winner of the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow back in the 1950s, et cetera, et cetera. So he was staying in the top floor suite of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. I drove up there and took the elevator up, and Cliburn was like the soul of Southern graciousness. He spoke in a honeyed, mellifluous baritone and gravely shook my hand. "Hello, Bob. How are you? You know, please come right in." It's like, "Can I offer you something to drink?" So on and so forth. So he was perfectly poised, you know, an elegant guy. So I sat at a couch right next to these windows overlooking Nob Hill in San Francisco. We began the interview. My recorder was on the table. And as the interview began, I noticed that there were some sirens coming up the street on Nob Hill, and they were getting louder and louder. So I said to Van, and the windows were open, I said, "Do you mind if I can shut these windows here? Can we shut those windows? Because I think the sound is intruding in the recording." And he said, "Oh, I'll do it." And he leaped out of his chair. I mean, he's like 6'4". He just shot up, and with his, which hand was it? His right hand, reaching for the window, he wound up hitting me right here as if he was trying to knock me out. I mean, it was bam, you know, it was like a Mike Tyson punch. And I had blood coming out, and of course I felt so bad for him. I mean, he was such a proper formal guy, and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." And I said, "No, don't worry about it, Van. You've just given me the lead to my article. It's the best lead I'm ever going to write." That lead was "Sirens wailed in the streets of San Francisco as Van Cliburn punched me in the mouth." If you're not going to read what follows, there's something wrong with you.
That's right. That is absolutely brilliant, Bob. And that probably gives a perfect summary of the Substack. So what I probably should let you describe it, Bob. Describe what you're attempting to do with your Substack.
Okay. Well, one thing I'm attempting to do is just occupy myself now that I'm retired. Something to do. But originally, when I started thinking about this a few years ago, I thought, well, you know, I've done lots and lots and lots of interviews, most of them in music, not all of them. And I began to think, well, maybe I could pass along some of what I learned in the form of some kind of a book. Originally, a hardcover thing was my plan, but that turned out to be just too difficult, complicated, and you know. Anyway, so I looked into Substack, I found out about it, and the plan was to obtain to run not articles that I've written, because some of the publications I worked for, they owned the editorial content, but I owned all the transcripts. I kept my transcripts over the years, you know, the recordings of the interviews. So the idea was, I think maybe I'll run this as a series of transcriptions of my interviews with some commentary. Um, Again, in the traditional fashion, you know, here I was at this time and place, and here was the feeling, but also with more of a journalistic spill. Here's why I asked this question at that time. Here's how I prepared for this interview, and so forth. So the idea originally was to appeal to, you know, writers coming up, or who wanted to know more about the dynamics of how you put an interview together. But the more I did that, I began realizing the interviews often speak for themselves, and so I think I'm writing serviceable intros. They do the job that they're supposed to do, and then I just let the transcript speak for itself. So obviously I delete all the uhs and ums and stuff like that, but basically it's what they said and what I said. So even if you're not a journalist, I think you might find it informative just to read how these conversations played out.
Yeah, look, I couldn't endorse that more strongly. So, and we will be posting a link to Bob's Substack in the show notes, but I could not recommend it highly enough. It is free. You can absolutely choose to subscribe, and I'm sure that's appreciated, Bob, as well. But the diversity of content, and your intros have been very modest, are just brilliant, succinct, showing your journalism chops to get you into the frame of what was going on at the time before the interview. It's just amazing. And linked to that, it doesn't have to be just related to what's on your Substack, but what are three, I know this is a very difficult question, but what are three artists, ideally keyboard players, but don't have to be, that have made the biggest impression on you as an interviewer?
Well, I don't think, I can't confine if I were to confine myself only to keyboard players for starts, I would say Billy Joel was ferociously intelligent, very, very intelligent, provocative, opinionated. You know, I remember I first interviewed him in Long Island before he was really famous. His office was in a strip mall, just like you see in any suburb. He rode up on his motorcycle, had his T-shirt on, took his helmet off. We talked there, and then about 5 years later, after he'd become a huge superstar, I interviewed him again. This time he was in the Beverly Hills Hotel in L.A. So the publicist led me to the elevator in the lobby that went directly to his suite, and the doors opened, and the publicist said, "Billy, here's Bob. You remember him?" And we shook hands, and Billy looked at me and said, "You've changed your glasses."
Wow.
I remember thinking, 5 years had passed. He'd become a superstar. He'd met 1 billion people. He remembered what glasses I used to wear. It was just really incredible. Another keyboard player that I think I've been thinking about this recently, that I became close to in a personal level, was Keith Emerson. And Emerson he's a good guy. He's easygoing and so forth. Of course, as you know, his life ended very sadly. But when we knew him, I must have interviewed him about 3-4 times. I had his home phone number, and we kept in touch. Last time I interviewed him was in San Francisco, and we met in just like a rehearsal warehouse someplace. And before everything began, before the equipment was set up and I began the interview, we were just talking. I said, "Keith, how you doing?" And he says, "I'm just really worried, man." I said, "Why? What's the matter?" He says, "My hands are killing me." He says, it's just really seriously, I feel pain whenever I play. I just don't know if I can keep playing or not. This might be the end. And I wasn't expecting that, obviously, but that became a primary focus of that interview. You probably remember that story. He was the thing about Keith, I think, is that he was not thoroughly trained in the traditional conservatory sense. He had phenomenal technique, but I think a lot of it was self-taught. And when you watched him play, you could see his hands were tense. Trained pianists know how to relax. And he tensed up when he played. And this was beginning to take its toll. My hunch is that was maybe an early step on the journey that led him to eventually, sadly, take his own life, because he valued his music so much. Terrible thing, but he impressed me. Well, he didn't impress me in that sense, but I had a good vibe with him personally. Let's put it that way. So, and as far as other interviews, you were asking, what are some of my, okay. 2 of them are on Substack now. One of them was with Joni Mitchell, who, again, very, very interesting, complex. We met in a cafe. If you're interviewing Joni Mitchell, you want to meet in a cafe somewhere. And we talked, had a really fascinating story. The whole interview's on Substack. And at the end, when we were done, she kept talking because she was a visual artist. At the time, I was married to an artist. And we kept talking about art. Meanwhile, I saw sitting in the corner these guys from the New York Times who were waiting for their shot at the interview. But finally said, "Joni, these guys from the Times, I don't want to cut into their time." She said, "That's all right. It's all right. But, what do you think about Paul Klee? What did you think about Kandinsky?" And I finally had to pull myself away because the Times guys were looking kind of ornery over there. The other really good interviews, oddly enough, there's one that's up there now with a guy that hardly anybody outside of a small group of people in Nashville has heard of, and that is a guy named Sam Powell, who's a horse whisperer. This guy was like a Zen master. And only part 1 is up there now, but as part 2 and 3 follow in the next few weeks, he gets deeper and deeper into kind of philosophy beyond just how do you train horses. It goes way beyond that. So, and there's much more to come from a lot of other people too. So we'll see.
That brings me to the next question I was going to ask you, Bob, about you've covered a lot of musicians, but you've also covered a diverse range of subjects. You start, a lot of them were keyboard players, but then they were different genres of keyboard players, different styles than you were familiar with at the time. And then you move on to more musicians. You were I don't remember the exact title of your position at Musician Magazine.
Yeah.
And then you're even interviewing guys like Sam Powell. I just read that when you published it last week.
Yeah.
You know, how do you handle approaching each very different subjects like that?
Well, if we're talking about different areas of music as opposed to interviews I've done that have nothing to do with music, I think step one for me is to, for example, I've done interviews with artists that I don't have a strong positive reaction to. I just don't like their music that much for whatever reason. But I know there's something there that somebody likes. And what I'll do is I'll listen deeper than I normally do. And then without fail, I find whatever it is that attracts that artist's followers. That's where I build the interview and start from there. Never has been a problem. So some research obviously is helpful. Back when I started at Keyboard Magazine in 1977, obviously in the dark ages, if I wanted to really thoroughly research something, there was no internet I could just hop onto. So I'd drive down to Stanford University to the music library, and I'd spend sometimes 2 days in the library sending request slips for back issues of old music magazines where there were interviews with these people, and that's how I did. I could do that whole thing now in half an hour online, obviously, but you can over research too. I think when I go into an interview, I might be straying a bit from the question you asked, but when I am getting ready to interview somebody, I'll sketch out just a really bare bones outline of a few questions I really intend to ask, and I'll keep the pen and paper nearby so that as we talk, if the person I'm talking to says something unexpected or different, I'll just jot a little note down. I'll follow that person wherever he or she wants to go. And as long as I can eventually return to the notepad to the next question, get through all of those, then I've got the complete story. But the main thing is be responsive. Really listen as you interview somebody. I remember there was a story I read years ago about the TV talk show host years ago, Dick Cavett, who had some author on his show, who had apparently been on assignment for a newspaper in Moscow during the years of Stalinism. And this guy was telling a story about how I got summoned to the Kremlin at this time, and 3 a.m. I was ushered into the Kremlin office, and there was Stalin. And Cavett was looking at his notes. He said, yeah. So do you have any hobbies? And it's kind of like, you just saw Joseph Stalin. I mean, come on, listen, man, So just listen. And one other thing, too, I'm just going on and on. Going from keyboard to musician was, in many ways for me, a really dramatic reassessment of my journalistic philosophy and outlook. When I got to musician, it's fair to say I hardly knew anything about music that didn't have a keyboard in it. And I had to learn fast. Luckily, there were a lot of really, really talented staff people and freelancers that I could have help me along with that. But, it's important to rely on writers that you have an affinity with if you're an editor with assignments. But I also ran into a new species of writer, that musician, that I didn't have to deal with at keyboard. The writers at keyboard, freelancers and staff writers, were professional musicians, most of them. They were people who could talk about the nuts and bolts of music or technology. The so-called marquee writers at musician were often journalists whose bylines were famous from Rolling Stone and from this and that. They had written books. Some of them were really great people, and I really loved working with them, especially Charles M. Young. Great guy, great journalist. There were others whose names were just as famous that I had some problems with because their writing was so self-oriented. One of these writers, I don't want to name names, did a Paul McCartney story that began with something like, "There I was in this room with Paul McCartney. I can't believe it. It's not about you being in the room with Paul McCartney. I like to keep myself in perspective. The story's not about me. And it's that style of journalism, what do you call it, like marquee journalism. I think it might be going a little bit out of fashion now. Again, I'm not really in touch with that kind of thing, but uh, I just had very little patience for writers who didn't get right into the artist, even if at the expense of their own presence in the story.
That leads me to my next question as well, because I was reading, you said something similar in your bio and your introduction to the Substack, where you said that you never were interested in collecting celebrity memorabilia. Your goal was always just to get what you needed for the story, hurry back to your office and start writing. Do you still have those feelings, though? I mean, you talked to Joni Mitchell and Keith Emerson and Billy Joel and all these people that many of us hold in some high esteem. What you may not have written that I was in the room with whoever, but what was your, I'm assuming it was more than just a job to you.
Oh God, yes. I mean, but it wasn't a celebration of myself as a wonderful writer, and so forth. I really was happy to have the opportunity to talk to a lot of these people, because if you're at that level of renown, you can't be stupid. I mean, all of these people got there not just because of talent, but because of smarts and because they knew how to work the system. So there was always something to learn about that. There's always a way to construct a dialogue with these folks that enlightened me, and through the prism of my writing, the readers as well. So, I considered myself really lucky to be in this line of work. It was, for me, fun. It was hardly ever a chore. I'm wandering again. You'll have to remind me of what you want.
And linked to that too, Bob, you mentioned about writers you've worked with. So who are some, and you mentioned Charles Young, who are some other writers that you admired both coming up as a journalist and maybe to this day?
Well, it's kind of an unusual group. And again, I'm kind of out of the business now, so I'm not in touch with a lot of the up-and-coming folks who I know there's a lot of talented newcomers. I guess Chuck Young was my favorite guy to work with. There was also, back in the musician days, let's see, who else? I never worked with Chet Flippo or Tim White, but I knew them both through musician. Actually, I did work with Tim White on one story, and that didn't turn out really that great for a variety of reasons. But Chet was like a real friend. I went to University of Texas with him, in fact. And so those guys, let's see, who else? What other writers? I'd have to think about that a little bit, because when I came to the Country Music Association, which was, of course, a wildly different thing, there was a whole new group of writers that I didn't know anything about. But by picking and choosing, I found the ones who were reliable, and it was just like going into a new garden and seeing a new species of plants all over the place, succulents and so forth, and sampling, see what was compatible with what I needed. But I'd have to. I really can't come up with a really long list. Chuck to me was the paragon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you just mentioned your move to the Country Music Association. What did you have to adjust in your approach, or what do you recall about that time? What sort of a transition was that for you?
It was different. First of all, I wound up in Nashville because Musician Magazine, the people who had purchased it decided, for reasons all their own, to shut down the headquarters in New York and move the operation to Nashville, where Billboard also had an office. They wanted to make that the headquarters. They offered everyone, a musician and the staff there, moving expenses, keep the same salary and all sort of thing. Everybody said no. Everybody quit except for me. And the reason I didn't quit is I was supporting a family. I had to have a job. So I came to Nashville, where I found the salary I was making in New York could buy me a plantation out there. It was really a lucrative salary. But after I don't know, it's 8 months or so, they shut the whole operation down, and suddenly I had to become a full-time freelancer for the first time in my life. I built up a good rhythm in freelancing, but I also kept in touch with the local writers. And when the opening came up at CMA Close Up Magazine for the editor's position, I went for it, and actually I went for it twice. The first time it went to another guy, another musician magazine alumnus, Peter Cronin, real good guy. He was the editor for about a year. Then he quit, and they called me back and said, "It's yours. We're not even interviewing anybody else. You want the job?" I said, "Yeah." Now, obviously, I had to learn a lot. I told people back in New York when they were kind of amazed to hear that I was going to be the editor of a country music magazine. I said, "Yeah, it's weird because to me, the word country means like a vacant lot in Queens. That's country." So, but I learned. I learned how to schmooze and how to, what the Opry was all about, this kind of thing. So, you adapt. You do what you can.
Yeah, that's why I love the vacant lot in Queens. That's excellent. And so here's a super simple short form question, Bob. Is long form journalism moribund or already dead?
Well, again, you're talking. I'm an anachronism these days as far as journalism. I don't really read music journalism that much anymore. I read the New Yorker. I read books about politics and culture and things like that. I really truly don't actually know what's going on in music journalism. But the writing that was on the wall when I was in the latter stages of that career indicated that. I mean, I remember the first time I was on my way to a gig in Nashville, and on the way there was this bookstore. We used to have bookstores here in Nashville, and I pulled off to get a copy of Rolling Stone. I hadn't seen it for a while. I was amazed to see Rolling Stone. The print edition was this tiny little pamphlet. Gone were the days of the big tabloid size thing, and so was Keyboard Magazine. It was there too, and it had become a sliver of what it used to be. That's when I began realizing, of course, it's all going online. And as it went online, it eliminated the necessity of having a gatekeeper, an editor who could say, this is good, that's not good, do that again. There were editors. I don't want to, it wasn't totally anarchy. But disgruntled writers could start their own blogs. They could start their own operations and have nobody temper what they were saying. That's kind of what Substack is, actually. But, so I think what it did was open these floodgates so that if there are, I'm sure there are really great writers in there, but it's hard to find them in this torrent of other folks. You find them on Substack. There's some really great people there. Ted Gioia and who I used to know in California, and Patti Smith has a really interesting Substack. But yeah, the thing is, as far as magazines are concerned, it's just, I think, I don't understand why anybody these days would want to become a magazine type journalist. I don't, I was lucky to have my career span the vigorous period that more or less started falling apart when I was done with it. So, my timing was lucky.
Yeah, I was a avid reader of Keyboard Magazine until the very end, and that started with in the 80s, when you were there, and so yeah. I want to go on to your book, 88: The Giants of Jazz Piano, and if you could tell us about that book. I think a lot of our listeners would be very, very interested in that.
At that time, I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where for a year I worked at allmusic.com as we were trying to launch this online magazine. And actually, a lot of the interviews that are going to be in my Substack are from the work I did there. So really, not just me, but there were a lot of good writers who were contributing to that. Anyway, that gig ended, and I was stuck in Ann Arbor. So I decided I might as well write a book and get an advance. And from the folks at Backbeat Books out in California, the idea was to write a book based on the number of keys on the piano, 88 keys. I would pick 88 pianists, more or less, my judgment. And there happened to be a CD store next door to the offices of allmusic.com. I became friend of the guy who ran it. So for about 10 months or so, I would just go in and borrow CDs of different jazz pianists. I'd go to the Ann Arbor Library, which had a really good collection of CDs. And of course, the archives at AllMusic, there were tons of CDs there. So out of all that, I listened, I took notes, I applied my own thoughts and analyses to the way people played, included some interviews that I had done from keyboard. and came up with the book. I think it's really good. I was proud of that book. I only got one copy left. I've given all the others away to friends and family. So, but that's my one and only book, I guess, actually, unless you count the Substack thing.
And Bob, is that still available as a new thing, or people can search for it obviously via all the amazing book repositories that are around to buy previous copies?
Yeah, probably. I know that the National Library had a copy, and I don't think it's there anymore. I don't know. I mean, if I was going to do an update, obviously there's a whole new world of younger pianists who are doing astonishing things. It would have to be a new cast of characters. So I don't know though. It's discouraging. In Nashville, I have a friend, a songwriter, Fred Collier is his name, who has written some really great country type tunes, but it's a tough way to make a living. So he wound up opening Rhino Books, a used bookstore here in Nashville. The music industry for songwriters, and even really gifted songwriters like Fred, was just not remunerative. Again, that had a lot to do with the post-Napster music culture online. It's analogous to what's happening in journalism with blogs and so forth. So he had to open a bookstore, and it's mainly used books. It's a really eclectic, interesting collection. But how many people are buying books? There's one other retail bookstore in Nashville, run by a noted author named Ann Patchett. It's called Pianist Books. But it's more of a I don't want to actually. I don't know much about the business side of bookstores, so I don't want to say anything as if I knew what I was talking about. But it's to see the number of bookstores disappearing, options like that. It's just it's discouraging. So I don't know if I would advise young writers that they can look forward to making a decent living in publishing. I just don't know if it's possible anymore. I don't understand why anybody would be a journalism major these days. I specialize in something else and then go into journalism as an expert in economics or politics or history or whatever.
Great point. I think, look, the journalism and book industry are both train wrecks, and that's a question we love asking all our guests as well, Bob, whether it's in your interview career or as a musician. Do you have a notable anecdote of when things have gone horribly wrong and you can look back on it now and laugh?
You mean just something not necessarily related to the industry as a whole? Oh God, yes. There's been so many. I'll tell you the worst nightmare. The worst is, and I wrote about this in my first kind of essay on Substack, is when you do an interview and you think you've got it in the bag, and you go back and you find out that the battery in the recorder had died, or in the old days the tape had gotten tangled up. It's humiliating, excruciating. That's happened to me several times, and I keep telling myself, never again. Next time I'm going to check the batteries, I'll have to, and then it happens again. So that's the worst. There was one interesting story. I did an interview with Christine McVie from Fleetwood Mac, and went to her house in was it Beverly Hills? One of those houses, Laurel Canyon. That's where it was. And as I showed up, she said, "Can you help me with something?" I said, "Yeah." This macaw that she owned had escaped its cage. So the beginning of my story about Christine was running around trying to catch this bird as it was flying around. And then a few minutes after that, when we settled down to do the interview, the bedroom door in her place opens up, and out comes Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys wearing a robe and looking really disheveled. And she said, the press is here. And he goes, "Whoops." And he goes back in the bedroom. But anyway, with Christine, we had a good interview, and it was on tape. To this day, when I do interviews, it's with a cassette tape, because I just know that how to run the transcribers really well. So I said, "Thank you, Christine." Put it in the suitcase, flew back to the Bay Area, and then I could not find the tape.
Oh.
I just couldn't find it. And I emptied the suitcase, and there was nothing there. I called Fleetwood Mac's publicist. I said, "Well, I'm sorry, that's the one shot you got. That's it." So that I was real. The last ditch thing. You know how sometimes you look for something and it's not there, but you go back 5 minutes later, maybe it is there. I noticed when I went back a rip in the lining of the suitcase, and I reached under the and there's the cassette. It had fallen into the lining, and so like the fates were on my side that time.
Wow!
But that's the worst.
Another question we'd like to ask all our guests is to tag a keyboard player that you would like to hear more about. You've probably talked to all of them, but maybe not.
Yeah, I just was on Facebook. I just discovered Jacob Collier.
Yeah.
That guy's a genius. I'm completely astonished at this guy's talent. And I think, there's just a parade of great piano players coming out of Berkeley and Juilliard and this sort of thing. But this guy is something else. He's like, I don't know. He's touched by some kind of spirit, you know.
He is.
I think we have a lot to look forward to from him. He's absolutely unbelievable.
Yes, I think the term force of nature is used too often, but it definitely applies to Jacob. He's amazing. He's definitely on our bucket list, Bob, so fingers crossed. And now we have the final dreaded Desert Island Discs question. So given your vast experience and history, whatever you can do to come up with 5 albums.
My desert island is pretty big, so I've got more than 5 albums, but I'll see if I can edit as I go along. Okay, they're not. Some of them are a little, off the beaten track. I have one album that I'm sure lots of people have named. That's Kind of Blue, Miles Davis. That album is perfection to me. It's just wonderful. I remember reading about some fan of Miles in the 50s who bought this LP on vinyl and was so struck by playing the first side that he never played the flip side for fear of being disappointed. That's how good, and he should have. It was great on both sides. I've also, and so some of these are a little obscure. There's a singer songwriter in LA named David Alvin who used to be with the Blasters, this kind of country punk band. He did a solo album called Blackjack David years ago. I interviewed him for somebody. I forgot who I was writing for. To me, this is beautiful songwriting, beautifully delivered. And there's a song on there called 1968, whose lyrics, to me, speak more about survivors of the Vietnam experience than any other song I've ever heard. It's really seriously moving. It's quite something. Years ago, No Depression magazine asked me to do an interview with a singer I'd never heard of. Liz Wright is her name. She was brand new, and I think it was it wasn't her debut album, her second album called Dreaming Wide Awake. They flew into New York. I interviewed her. This album is just beautiful. It's a beautiful record. I think her style has changed somewhat since then, but it's the whole record is like the title, Dreaming Wide Awake. It's this hallucinatory, dreamy, just kind of magical album. It's really fantastic. Okay, that's 3, right? Okay, so I'm going to go with, and this is kind of, again, a little odd maybe, Enya doing Watermark. Just intrigued with her when I read an interview with, God, I can't remember who it was, some punky keyboard player in England. And I'd never heard of her, but the interviewer said, "What do you think of Enya?" And he said, "I can't listen to her. It's too beautiful." I said, "How can something be too beautiful?" So I got the album, and it is beautiful. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And I made sure that I had an opportunity to interview her at Musician. I was like, it's like I was with my prom date. I was just like, oh, shucks, wow, you're Enya, this kind of thing. That was really fantastic. That's 4. Okay, so here are the also-rans. I would go with the Beach Boys' Surf's Up, genius album, especially Until I Die, which is a scary song, but just so incredible. And I would go with Los Super 7, their title album. It's Conjunto Music, recorded with members of various Mexican and Mexican-American groups. I can't remember who they were, but it's a fantastic album, lots of spirit. And I love the Peter Gabriel Shaking the Tree, which is it's just, Gabriel is, wow, the live version of Blood of Eden on that album is so sublime. It's that long note that he holds off. It's recorded, I think, at Glastonbury or someplace like that. But finally, I got to go with the Mavericks. This album called In Time. They're based in Nashville, and when I saw them play at the CMA Music Festival, big stadium, I would be working to get stories online covering the festival. But every now and then I could take a break and just wander off through the crowd. When those guys played, it was ecstasy. People were just dancing, and Raul Malo's, is it Raul Malo? Is that his name? Raul? Yeah, anyway, Raul. His vocals were incomparable. Great band, great album. So there you go. That's my little melange right there.
No, that's amazing picks, and I know I'm not meant to be part of this interview, but I get huge selfish benefit out of those because I get to check out music I may not necessarily know. So I appreciate that. And Bob, look, I cannot thank you enough. You use the word sublime in relation to Peter Gabriel, but I think it's fair to say your writing fits that term as well. And your career has been amazing, and I cannot wait to see what continues to come out of Substack. I do again recommend to people to check that out. I feel like we need to revisit at some stage, Bob, and hopefully we can, catch up again down the track. But for this episode, I cannot thank you enough.
Well, if you ever make it up to Nashville, I will buy the first cheap drink for you at Gannon's.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Joe, what a pleasure it was speaking with Bob. To say someone's a font of knowledge is never more applicable than in the case of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And he described in the interview how he approaches when he did interviews. And I not only learned so much, but I learned why his interviews affected me so. I often tell the story that when I would read like his interviews in Keyboard Magazine, I would read the intro and read the interview, and it'd be of some artist I'd never heard of. And I'd be amazed, and I'd be like, wow, this person sounds so interesting and everything's so fascinating. And I have to go check this artist out. And a lot of times I'd listen to it and go, no, it just wasn't for me, but I'd go back to the article and it was still great and interesting and informative. And when you listen to you've heard now why that is. And he found what was interesting about each of his subjects. And he was very skilled at that. He was very good at bringing the stories out of the people that he talked to and presenting that to us. It was just a pleasure to talk to someone whose career I followed. I mean, starting in keyboard, when he moved to Musician Magazine, I was reading Musician Magazine because he went there. I knew that his stuff was going to be good. And then he went to All Music and didn't follow him as much there because it was a little harder, but I was always trying to follow him. And now I'm following him on Substack.
That's right.
And getting the history. And I love it.
No, I absolutely agree. And so, please do take the time to check the show notes on keyboardchronicles.com for Bob's Substack. So it is called, if you go to Substack, you'll definitely find it because it's a unique title, as we've said, Van Cliburn, Punch Me in the Mouth. And what a great anecdote that alone is. That gives you a hint of just how the quality of what Bob provides on his Substack. It's huge. So, look, cannot thank Bob enough for his time. It was an absolute pleasure. And I do feel like we've got unfinished business. So I look forward to chatting with him again in the future. Joe, thank you, sir, as always. It's always great to have you. And Joe and I were talking before the show. We're hoping to meet face-to-face on assumption of a US trip for me next year. And about time you got down to Australia, Joe. That's all I'll say.
My wife would love that. I don't know about me, but I guess if I have to come see you, I will.
Yeah, okay. Don't force yourself.
No, it's a pleasure, David.
And look,
I enjoy doing these partially because I get to connect with you too.
Yeah, that's right. No, it is. It's a real pleasure. And thank you to all of you out there for listening. Please do let us know what you think of this or any other thing that we do. As you know, we can be emailed at any time at editor@keyboardchronicles.com. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook Threads. What have I missed? We're on LinkedIn. Joe, did you? We have a few people that, do keep up with us on LinkedIn and so on. And obviously the main site at keyboardchronicles.com. We do have a YouTube channel, which you're likely watching this on. But if you're one of the many audio listeners, that's another way you can access us as well. So thank you all. Keep on playing and we'll talk soon.